First Nations self-government. Our inquiry question is, to what extent is the Indigenous population attempting to regain their self-governing rights, and through what specific actions have they implemented? Throughout this presentation, we'll be looking at the self-government for First Nations and how it changed, along with what they are trying to do to bring it back.
The Indigenous people of Canada had self-government until the British North America Act was passed on by Britain in 1867. The British North America Act allowed the Canadian government to have democracy and sovereignty over the First Nation.
In 1876, the Indian Act was passed, which allowed the Canadian government to have control over the First Nations' land, will, education, resources, and more. Though this capitalism had a major impact on the Indigenous as private companies claimed these resources, it also introduced the Department of Indian Affairs, which made laws against the First Nations and had agents to monitor them. While the Indigenous population mainly wanted to benefit the communities, the government focused on helping the nation as a whole, or what seemed to be the right thing to do at this specific time.
In 1969, the White Paper was passed down by the government to allow the First Nations to have equal rights as the Canadian citizens, but the First Nations opposed to this because it was a method to assimilate them. The First Nations responded with their own variation of the White Paper, known as the Red Paper, which demanded their communities, treaties, and cultural rights to be respected by the Canadian nation.
There were many efforts on behalf of the Canadian government and the First Nations to allow the First Nations to get self-government back. A form of success that they had was through Section 35 of the Constitution Act in 1982, which recognized the First Nations' cultural and treaty rights.
Another example of the Indigenous and the government working together to reach a common goal through the Western Arctic Claim. The act allowed for the Inuvialuit to have a small amount of self-governing power by creating the Western Arctic Regional Municipality.
Finally, in August 1995, the Government of Canada recognized the right of self-government for Canada's Aboriginal people by publishing their Federal Policy Guide.
In the future, we need to start fabricating policies that reflect and relate the understanding the government has for the Indigenous people.
Restoring the old practices that the First Nations had a long time ago will help allow them to have a working government system. It is also a way for many people to connect through governing methods they once shared.
We believe that there has been a moderate amount of action taken to the government. Although there have been multiple agreements and solutions that have taken place in the recent past, there is a potential to regain stronger rights. The Canadian government should be more willing to discuss issues with the Indigenous. Looking back to our inquiry question, a conclusion can be made. The Indigenous population has moderately pushed their efforts regarding their self-governing rights, and by researching the specific actions that they have implemented, we can deduce that they have chosen effective ways that will be able to help them in the future.
Thank you for listening.